Matos, you can start. Matos?
Okay, so
you
good afternoon.
Can start.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry, I was just waiting for the video. Good afternoon. I think it's still afternoon, everybody, or evening. My name is Matos Mishik. Welcome to the ENLIGHT lecture that is entitled Tackling Climate Change, the Humanities Perspective, where we are going to talk about how humanities can help us to deal with climate change issues and how can they help us to mitigate climate change. I'm happy to introduce three speakers. I'm the fourth one actually today of this lecture. We will have four presentations, and then we will have a discussion. I would like also actually start with a short note on the discussion. If you would have a question that you think, and this is a message to our audience, if you would have a question that you think would be best answered immediately, please don't hesitate to post it into the chat, and we will I will ask the question for you to our presenter. So we have three distinguished guests today. First is Nessa Cronin, who is a lecturer in area studies and an associate director of Moore Institute for the Humanities and Social Studies at National University of Ireland in Galway. And she's an interdisciplinary scholar, and her current research explores how conversation across fields of the arts and science can help us to deal with climate change issues. And she will be talking today about why art and humanities are important for society and how they can help us to mitigate climate change and to solve the challenges that we are facing connected to climate change and sustainability in general. So this will be kind of she will provide kind of an introduction to the whole lecture, because she will provide a very broad picture where we currently are and what humanities can do in this area. The second distinguished speaker tonight will be Seth Epstein, who is a researcher at the Center for Multidisciplinary Research on Religion and Society at Uppsala University. And he's going to talk about their ongoing project that examines potential challenges, politics, and resistance to conceiving and implementing rights of nature. And he will be talking about this concept tonight. He's going to talk about the relationship between the idea of a human species identifying identity and rights of nature development. To be honest, I'm very interested in this one because this is something very new for me. So I'm really intrigued. Then I'm going to, my name is Matos Mishik, as I think I already mentioned, and I'm a political scientist, so I'm a little bit the odd one here in this group of humanities scholars. I'm going to talk about climate humanities and how humanities can contribute actually to answer some of the difficult questions connected to climate change and climate change mitigation that we political scientists have. I study mostly energy transition and decarbonization within the European Union. Our last but not least speaker tonight will be Antonio Casado da Rocha, who is researcher at the University of the Basque Country. I really hope I didn't change his affiliation or position. And he has been focused on, or he has been publishing widely on environmental issues, research, and healthcare ethics. And he will be talking about research that they are conducting at his university. He's going to introduce several researchers that they are working on at the university, at his university. This is very interesting because he's going to talk about how philosophy can help us actually to look at issues and challenges connected to climate change from a different perspective, and how they can how philosophy can help us to think unthinkable. This is something I think will be very much thought-provoking, and I'm looking forward. Also, I'm looking forward to all four presentation, except with mine, of course. I already know mine. So I think I broke enough ice for now. So I would like to give floor to Nessa Cronin to share her presentation and have her lecture. I would like to ask her to keep to 10 to 15 minutes. So there will be enough room for questions. And I would just like to stress again that for the members of the audience, if you have some questions, please don't hesitate to ask them. And if you think that they should be answered immediately, we will do our best to answer them as soon as possible. So thank you very much, and enjoy the lecture.
Great. Thank you very much, Matus. I just want to make sure that my slides move okay. I had a little difficulty earlier. So is the second one there?
Unfortunately, we still see only
first
your,
one. Okay.
your mode and the first one.
Okay, so going to try this one again here.
Maybe stop sharing again, then start it, and
yeah,
same as yes last time.
No problem.
Thank you.
Okay, so it's on notes mode there. I might just keep it on this mode if that's okay, Ben.
That's completely fine.
Yeah.
Just go ahead.
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, so I have my timer here, Matus, so I'll be very diligent. I'll keep within the 15 minutes, and feel free to just wipe me off the Zoom if I go over, okay? So I just want to say thank you very much for the invitation to contribute to the webinar series today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing and learning insights from the different partners involved in the ENLIGHT program, but also from the attendees who are participating and listening in, and also to say that I know many people will be watching this back afterwards on video, so do feel free to email us afterwards as well too with any thoughts or comments. What I'm going to present really are just some observations on these questions that many of us have been dealing with and tackling and trying to come to terms with in recent years. So I really welcome any thoughts or comments or suggestions on what is very much a work in progress as well too. My own background is in philosophy and literature, and in more recent years I have moved into the realm of environmental humanities via Irish studies more generally. But my work in recent years has argued for the need for more integrated, interdisciplinary and inclusive approaches to addressing the all of society challenges that are associated with climate change and biodiversity loss in the century. Today, however, very briefly, I am just going to really focus on the role of culture in particular in addressing this planetary challenge. But before I get started, I'm going to pull the rabbit out of the hat, and I'm going to give you the conclusions. So this is it. It's very easy. 4 things I'm going to say. So this is it on one screen. I'm really just going to argue for the absolute importance for arts, humanities, and social science scholarship and arts practice. I've written a little bit about this recently, and I'll post that blog piece later in the chat. Secondly, I'm going to argue that we need to remind ourselves how culture has been stated and acknowledged as the 4th pillar of sustainability, but for some reason it gets left off, or it's invisible or forgotten about. Thirdly, I'm going to argue that culture should be seen as a core eco-social infrastructure for any kind of policy and planning at national levels, and particularly at EU funding levels and policy levels. And finally, in relation to where we are today and what we've learned through the COVID crisis, we're dealing with the 2 crises at the moment, COVID and climate, is looking at the ethical imperatives of social solidarity. So this will bring, I suppose, discussions about that we maybe haven't had enough about in Ireland anyway, about the philosophical impact and the philosophical implications of what it means to be in this together in many ways, and the role of philosophy and philosophers to participate in a public discussion about this and shaping these ideas into the future. We are living in an emergent era, I would argue, a time of the no longer and the not yet, and that's where my paper is going to start today. It's a curse to live in interesting times, so goes the ancient Chinese proverb that Hannah Arendt was known to cite in the last years of her life. In her essay, No Longer and Not Yet, Arendt argued that the decline of the old and the birth of the new is not necessarily an affair of continuity between the generations, between those who for some reason or other still belong to the old and those who either feel the catastrophe in their very bones or have already grown up with it, that the chain is broken and an empty space, a kind of historical no man's land, comes to the surface, which can be described only in terms of no longer and not yet. In that essay, she observes, quote, Hume once remarked that the whole of human civilization depends upon the fact that, quote, from Hume, one generation does not go off the stage at once and another succeed, as is the case with silkworms and butterflies. At some turning points in history, however, at some heights of crisis, a fate similar to that of silkworms and butterflies may befall a generation of men, end quote. For many of us living through these pandemic times, we seem to be in such a similar period of stasis, in a collective caesura of an indistinct now, caught between the pre and the post-COVID worlds, stuck in a historical no man's land that has continued somehow in calendar time, but has not yet quite fully moved on to its future, whatever that may be. In a similar vein, after the first wave of the COVID crisis in Europe, Turkish writer and essayist Elif Shafak wrote of the world to come and argued that, quote, this is a threshold. The old world is simply no more. The old world is gone, and yet we do not know what kind of a new world we want to build. It is a state of in-betweendom, full of anxiety and uncertainty, and fertile ground for demagogues and their false promises of redemption. Rereading Arendt for a graduate seminar earlier this year reminded me of Raymond Williams's ideas of structures of feeling and the identification that he thought of emergent cultures in a time of dramatic social change. The signals of what Williams terms pre-emergence, as well as the more evident forms of what he called the emergent, the residual, and the dominant forms of culture and social landscapes, are instructive to track and trace in epoch-making times of dramatic socio-political change. And we can see glimpses of this in the now, of the possible futures that are being laid down in present times. Second point, culture as key infrastructure and the fourth pillar of sustainable development. Much of the discourse surrounding the COP26 meeting in Glasgow was led by political leaders, informed by scientific communities, and was primarily focused on progressing international agreements and policies in order to address the planetary urgency of the climate and biodiversity crises. However, if cultural vitality in its broadest sense is recognized and acknowledged as the fourth pillar of sustainability, then any policy initiatives in relation to societal and environmental and social change that fail to take into account the importance of culture will only have a very limited success in ambition, scope, and scale. Culture was recognized as the fourth pillar of sustainable development in 2010 to be added alongside the more familiar ones that many of you in the Zoom room will know as the economic, social, and environmental pillars. But since that time, the cultural pillar has all too often fallen off the international agenda and has largely remained invisible in policy documents on sustainability at local, national, and international levels. As an example from Ireland, while a recent announcement on creative climate action in Ireland is to be welcomed, and the role that culture and the arts play more broadly is still largely siphoned, however, off into subcategories of very limited funding streams via state bodies, and is still not centrally placed and funded as a core eco-social infrastructure and key resource in terms of climate action planning, policy, or public engagement. A perfect example of this is how a word search of culture in the Irish government's Climate Action Plan 2021, Securing Our Future document, which was published just before COP26 on the 4th of November last year, shows absolutely no entry for culture on its own, but has 94 entries in a 208-page document in which culture is found only in terms of agriculture, aquaculture, and horticulture. So looking at a very historical sense of what culture is in terms of cultivare, inhabitation and tending, etc. Similarly, and somewhat depressingly, the arts are found 5 times, but all only in relation to the word parts. The arts and culture are then literally absent from core Irish climate policy, and culture as the 4th pillar of sustainability is nowhere to be seen. And I'd encourage everybody on the call from their own national perspectives to look at their own national documents and look for culture and the arts and see what you come up with. It would be very interesting as a comparative inquiry to see where, if in any place, it is in the core national documents and not just in the documents for the arts. 3, speculative imaginaries, the role of the arts and humanities. In his sci-fi fiction, this slide is also called Don't Look Up. So for any of you who have seen the movie, this is referencing that. In his sci-fi novel, The Ministry for the Future, set in a not too distant time, American science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson has his character Mary Murphy, who is in the novel a former foreign minister of Ireland, lead an international task force, which is set up in the novel after the Paris Agreement. And this is mandated with managing the survival of all species and creatures through the climate crisis of the novel. With the name and nationality notionally hinting at Ireland's former president and UN Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, the novel poses questions such as who or what is responsible for the climate crisis and how it might be fixed through various mechanisms in the novel, ranging from carbon taxes to mass societal change and experimentation to risky geoengineering projects. But if there is an element of any kind of cautious hope in the novel itself, it is that it points to the realization that throughout our life course as human beings, we are all interdependent species on the planet, and the survival of our species in turn depends on the successful survival of many other forms of life on Earth. The speculative fiction of the sci-fi genre, it helps us to work through such future scenarios and consider indeed how disaster planning, climate mitigation and adaptation strategies may work out in different ways for some, usually for the wealthier citizens of the global north. And here we're thinking of Elon Musk and Richard Branson and their rejection of Earth as a future planetary place, and we need to go elsewhere. It can also help us connect to the emotional worlds and real-life experiences of readers better than any graph of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or economic spreadsheet of climate insurance assessors. As Alison Tickle, the founder and CEO of Julie's Bicycle, which is a cultural organisation in Scotland focused on creative climate action, she has stated that, quote, no amount of data, science or technology can ever make us feel the world in the same way that art can, end quote. Writers of climate fiction engage with the crossover genres of science fiction and the utopian novel in order to speak to and possibly capture ideas and speculative imaginaries of different climate futures. Of the role of the artist in imagining the not yet of Hannah Arendt, social theorist Boaventura de Sousa Santos writes that, quote, the artist specializes in the not yet, the emergent, the latent, the potential, whatever is on its way to be recognized and to add innovatively to the artistic present, end quote. Similarly, writer and critic Jennifer Wenzel has argued that the role that art can play in making us rethink, review, and reconsider questions from different perspectives, in what she calls the defamiliarizing double take question that artworks can sometimes offer, the weight, what is that question? And here the work of Fiona Woods, an Irish artist, sets up those kinds of questions literally on a billboard, but makes you kind of stop and look at interspecies identification and open up that weight, what is that kind of question here? 4, conclusions, staying with the trouble and eco-social solidarity. What we've learned from the pandemic is that what happens on one side of the world, whether it's Wuhan, arrives to other shores, Lombardy, Manaus, New Delhi, and elsewhere very, very quickly. The existential interdependency of our species and our world is not just in terms of biological interconnections, but is also networked into ecological and technological rhizomes of economic, cultural, and political systems, some strands of which are more extractive or nourishing than others. The apparent lack of national pandemic preparedness is mirrored in many ways by a lack of joined up thinking and all of government approaches to climate preparedness across the globe. Historian Adam Tooze has famously argued that COVID-19 is the first economic crisis of the Anthropocene era, and that the pandemic is forcing us to rethink how we manage our networked world. If this is a dress rehearsal for the next big one, it does not bode very well for the speed of change and scenario planning that will be needed for climate action to protect the vulnerable regions and populations, both now and in the future. And indeed, many communities around the world, whether it's Australian bushfires, Hurricane Katrina, or more recent climate disasters, and also heat waves across Europe, many populations and communities have already experienced this. Indeed, I would go one step further than twos to argue that COVID-19 is not just the first economic crisis of the Anthropocene era, but the first biopolitical crisis of the Anthropocene and Anthropocenic governance. And here I'm really leaning on the work of Michel Foucault and his idea of biosecurity and the difference between governance and management as well. Because it directly impacts the quality of life, health outcomes, excess mortality rates, societies, environments, and economies, and all in direct relation to one another on an unprecedented global scale. So this is just ramping up Tooze's argument. If we are now entering an era of pandemics, we need a more agile and an open form of species thinking. In particular, we're thinking of the cross-contamination of environmental ecosystems, the question of species crossover and viral crossover. And of course, this is all about the environmental degradation of habitats and species loss and habitat loss that gives rise to viral cross-species infection in the first place. This also in turn demands a more radical ontology of being, so the philosophical questions that opens up a different and differentialized way of relating to each other and indeed to the wider web of life across the planet. And here I'm drawing on the work of Jason Moore and Karen Barrett in particular. Key to this then is the ethical imperative of solidarity across communities, borders, and political divides. As the director of the European Environmental Agency, Hans Brunicic has observed, solidarity is key to the COVID-19 recovery and a better and a more sustainable future. Difficult decisions, he says, will need to be made in 2022 to address the twin challenges of COVID and climate, and lower ambitions or delayed action risks higher economic and social costs in the long run, and that, quote, addressing social inequalities in this sustainable transition is the key to a better future for us all, end quote. What is needed then is what philosopher Isabel Stengers has argued as a cosmopolitical present, and the determination with what Donna Haraway has been calling for is that we need to stay with the trouble, we need to stay the course. This determination to stay with the trouble will be needed all the more as the decade progresses, where the insights from humanities scholars on discussing and determining the times in which we live will be vital in answering and addressing the new ethical and societal considerations encountered. In particular, the independence of universities, research institutes, public-facing institutions and platforms are now even more important than ever in being spaces to steward new discourses, challenge ideas, and in keeping scientific and critical thinking open and working in tandem. As Donna Haraway reminds us, we do indeed need to stay with the trouble of the here and now, learning from the past to create a better future. And as she says, staying with the trouble requires learning to be truly present, not as a vanishing pivot between an awful or Edenic past, so she's not saying the doomsday kind of scenario, and apocalyptic or salvic futures, but as moral critters entwined in myriad unfinished configurations of places, times, matters, and meanings. Finally, one core lesson of these pandemic times is not just of what to think, but of how to think. And this is the value of the arts and humanities scholarship. And to remember the value in remaining open to other ideas, new evidence, and alternative points of view and perspectives. The future cannot just be a better version of the past, just like getting an iPhone upgrade. It has to be of a completely new configuration, design, and meaning to fit the changed purposes of what Elif Chirac has called this threshold moment. If this is the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, 2021 to 2030, perhaps we need to go a step further towards a more comprehensive and inclusive eco-social regenerative decade, not just about restoration of the past, but regenerating for the future. Not just to sustain the societies we have created, but to regenerate the people, the places, and the planet in which we live for more ecological, secure, and more socially inclusive futures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful. And thank you also for keeping the time. And now I'd like to give the floor to Seth Epstein and his presentation.
Let's see here. Can you see that? Is that, you see? All right, excellent. So thank you for having me. I'm also very excited to be here. And I am going to talk today about species identity and rights in nature. I am part of a research project titled Realizing Rights of Nature, Sustaining Development and Democracy. And we received funding through the Swedish Research Council, Formus's call for research into the UN's Sustainable Development goals outlined in Agenda 2030. So more than a decade ago, historian Deepesh Chakrabarty called for the adoption of a human species identity as a necessary response to the Anthropocene. The prospect of a human species identity and its possible role in addressing challenges for contemporary political thought has since generated a great deal of discussion. While there has been and is no unanimity regarding the definition, implications, or wisdom of the adoption of a species identity, a rough outline of its presumed characteristics has come into focus by virtue of this interdisciplinary and ongoing discussion. A human species identity tends to be conceptualized as relational. It privileges human, non-human interactions and explains these interactions through interdependence. These characteristics themselves reflect trends in multiple disciplines. As a consequence, species identity directs our focus towards obligations as they arise in local contexts, even as scholars recognize the global networks within which particular places are enmeshed and the planetary force of humanity. Sorry, I like to walk when I talk, and I can't do that, so I just, Now, given this focus, rights of nature developments come into view as a possible means of encouraging a human species identity. Rights of nature is an umbrella term referring to the different measures taken in a variety of jurisdictions to treat either all of nature within state boundaries or specific natural features such as rivers or mountains as legal actors with rights. It is informed to a significant extent by Earth jurisprudence, which holds that human systems should fit within natural systems. According to legal scholar David Cox, despite their differences, the various initiatives to extend rights to natural non-humans share a common, quote, aim to enshrine in the law the fundamental symbiosis between human and non-human ecological health, and to empower suitable stewards who will nurture that symbiosis. And Ecuador is a very prominent example, whose constitution in 2008 recognized rights of Mother Earth to integral respect for its existence and for the maintenance and regeneration of its life cycles, structure, functions, and evolutionary processes. Now, both rights of nature and species identity have been criticized by some and advocated by others as a response to what the Anthropocene demands of us. Their ambiguous status is why their potential intersection deserves our attention. New Zealand's arrangements in particular may offer an example of how rights of nature can foster a human species identity. These recent arrangements emerged out of long-term efforts by Maori tribes, or iwi, to reclaim self-determination and contest colonial treaties that imposed Western notions of sovereignty upon them and upon disputed ecosystems. In 2014, the Crown Government of New Zealand recognized the legal personhood of the land previously designated Te Urera National Park and empowered the Tuhoi tribe of the Maori to represent this legal entity and create and, quote, integrated ecosystem management plan that protects its interests. The Wanganui River has also been recognized as a legal person since 2017, but I'm going to speak about Te Uera today. Yeah, I went a little fast there. Okay. Notions of interdependence and consequently of obligation have shaped rights of nature in New Zealand. While legal personhood is often perceived as a grant of rights to entities, this capacity for rights holding was not its most important feature for the Maori iwi involved in the negotiations. As rights of nature scholars Craig Kaufman and Pamela Martin point out, for the Tūhoe, rights is a foreign concept. Instead, as they note, the discussions between the Tūhoe and the Crown government created the chance to translate, quote, Maori conceptions of nature and human responsibilities to it into New Zealand law. Despite their use of the tool of legal personhood, then the agreements facilitate focus on responsibility and reciprocal relational obligation rather than rights when managing human relations with land. These arrangements therefore resonate with the advocacy of legal scholar Peter Burden for an approach focused not on rights, but rather, as Burden puts it, quote, the obligations we owe to each other and the broader living system. Furthermore, how this perception of the primacy of obligation takes shape also addresses the similar concern that critics of a species identity and rights of nature have separately expressed, that these ideas do not sufficiently acknowledge human uniqueness or the responsibility that flows from that uniqueness. Clive Hamilton, for instance, has criticized a species identity for, among other things, overemphasizing what is shared between humans and non-humans rather than what sets humans apart. Burden has voiced a similar concern. The rights of nature does not adequately account for the singular power of humans in the Anthropocene. While both authors would object to displacing onto nature responsibilities they feel are best assigned to humans, as Kaufman and Martin point out, rights of nature in New Zealand is about managing people, not managing the land. Unlike in another prominent rights of nature example, Ecuador, where justice has largely been remedial, applied to all of nature, and available for anyone to seek through the courts, the Tūhoe iwi can define human responsibilities in relation to a specific ecosystem and the actions those responsibilities prohibit or necessitate. This authority allows for, in Kaufman and Martin's judgment, proactive action. The actions undertaken jointly by the Te Uera Board, bush crews, and operations teams, according to the authors, tends to, quote, reject the Western conservation view of nature as a museum that is to be seen but not touched. The perception of distinct zones of untouched wilderness and unfettered human access to nature prevent close examination of human, non-human relations and inhibit human self-consciousness as species. Kaufman and Martin describe in contrast one example of what they call Earth jurisprudence and practice in the former national park, the management of possums, which were introduced to the ecosystem in the 19th century and lack non-human predators. The Tūhoe place limitations on possums by hunting and trapping them, rather than by spraying them with poison as had been previously done. Kaufman and Martin note that the Tūhoe relate to the possums differently than had the state government, as hunting the animal affords families a living, since they consume its meat and convert its fur into products which are then sold. Humans' role as the only natural predator in that ecosystem is important. The Tūhoe voice, quote, a duty to help maintain the possum population at a level that will not overwhelm the ecosystem and cause other important species to go extinct, which is a possibility if the possum population goes unchecked. The health of the ecosystem concerns the Tuhoi, who, according to Kaufman and Martin, recognize themselves as, quote, part of the forest ecosystem and must live off the land. Thus, the Tuhoi recognize humans' relational place within an ecosystem and at the same time, humanity's unique capabilities to purposefully manage the possum population. This approach appears to echo the counsel of those like Ian Bauckham, who advocate a conception of freedom that acknowledges the interconnectedness of all entities as an expression of human species identity. As Kaufman and Martin point out, people gain from their relationship with the land. However, the realization of these interests of people depends on their own ability to, quote, manage their own behavior in a way that protects the entire ecosystem. This management is predicated on a relational ethic and is by no means a one-way transaction, which exclusively benefits non-human nature. The institutionalized arrangements, laws, and opportunities to be proactive rather than reactive are particularly significant in light of Chakrabarty's own contention that, quote, we humans never experience ourselves as a species. In response, Ursula Heiss has pointed out that many kinds of identities, such as national identities, are not themselves lived and experienced without the, quote, institutions, laws, symbols, and forms of rhetoric that establish such abstract categories as perceptible and livable frameworks of experience, thus suggesting that a species identity could be knowable, lived in a similar fashion. Finally, I will say that it is certainly possible that rights of nature developments amount to a transitional effort to a more ecological law, and only that, a transitional effort, as Jeffrey Garver has suggested will be their fate. Even as a transitional effort, rights of nature may yet contribute a great deal to a species identity by making novel use of the familiar tool of rights. Identities are perhaps reworked as much as they are invented. Even in a transitional role, rights of nature may facilitate a species identity for humans precisely because it uses tools implicated in the previous anthropocentric, legal and political organization. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you very much. It was your timing was perfect. If you can maybe stop sharing, because I think now it's my turn, and I have a problem with sharing. Of course I do, but I will try. I will try anyway. I'm sorry about this. This hasn't happened to me today yet, but usually it happens from time to time. If not, I will be just talking and you will be forced to.
Matusz, this is
Yes.
for all the audience. This is the tech host. Do you have problems sharing within Zoom, or
No,
there you
no.
are?
Yeah, there I am. Sorry, this was just I don't know. I had to allow it again. I don't know why. From my computer. I hope now you should see the full screen. I really hope so. Sorry about the glitch.
We don't, but
you don't?
no, we don't. I think slideshow is on a different screen.
Sorry. I'll try to redo it. What about now? No.
Go with this. We can see it, right?
And can you see the changing? Can you see the second slide now, or not really?
Fortunately
Okay,
not. Click on
I
the,
will-
if you click on the slides individually, then they can be
Sorry,
That's all
sorry
right.
about that. I don't know where is the problem here. So I'm going to talk about climate humanities. This is a project that I've been working on for some time, but it's still in making. So I would really love to kind of talk about where we are at now. There's only my name here, but I'm working in collaboration with colleagues from Humanities. So this is kind of interdisciplinary research between political scientists and people who are working in humanities. So that's why I'm going to focus on the part of political science. I'm going to focus on the problem that we have identified, and we claim that the solution can be found in humanities. And I think I don't really need to talk a lot about what is the kind of main climate policy problem or climate change problem, but basically the issue that is kind of the main problem is that there is a lot of emissions, and that historically and also currently there is a lot of greenhouse gases emissions. And although there has been a consensus on the level of scientific within scientific community, on the level of scientific community, meaning natural science community, that this emissions are man-made, of course, and the cause of these emissions is increase of temperature, and the increase of temperature causes climate changes. And there is a consensus that these issues all are caused by man. So at the end of the day, the climate change is anthropocentric, so anthropogenic. Sorry, and because of this scientific consensus was translated into a political consensus, meaning that there were efforts at national level, but also internationally, to do something about this. For example, in the 90s, there was the famous Kyoto Protocol that kind of led nowhere. And nowadays there is Paris Agreement, which I'm afraid is going to go at least very similar direction. But there still is a consensus on these two levels, on the level of scientific community and on the level of political community or international relations and politics in general. But where we see is where we think is a problem is that there is no consensus on the level of public, and this is very, very important, because public people are the ones who are actually using stuff and who are buying things that are produced with use of a lot of energy, and in the process a lot of energy is consumed and a lot of emissions are emitted. So the public is the key here, and there is a lot of there is a lot of climate change skepticism. So public doesn't, there is no consensus at the level of public. So public doesn't really believe that, uniformly, that there is some man-made climate change. And what this kind of and we can kind of identify. We have identified two periods. The first one, during the first period, people or public or skeptics didn't question the science. They did question the interpretation of the results of the science. So they were saying that, okay, there is some climate change. There is a climate change. Temperature is rising, but this is not man-made. This is just a natural process where there is a cycle of warmer and colder periods, and now we are going towards warmer periods. So there is nothing that we can do about, and no matter how much we are going to change our lives, no matter how much greener we are going to go, there won't be any change when it comes to this trend, because this doesn't depend on what we are doing as a humanity, as people. But they were still saying, even the critics were saying that, okay, there are some changes, but we don't have anything with them, because it's something else. It's not anthropocentric. It's not caused by people. And then we believe there was a very important change in perspective. And the current perspective talks more about that there is, the current critics criticize not the results of the science, but the science itself. They are talking that, there is basically mistrust in science and the scientific process. This mistrust is present, and this climate criticism is presented by several types of actors. Those are individuals, different movements, also politicians, of course. For example, populist politicians within the European Union. It's very common, I would even say. Definitely far-right political parties, although they are not all of them. There has been more research, and things are. It turns out that it's a little bit more complicated than it seems at the first sight, but still, these are very important actors when it comes to climate skepticism. And these actors have quite strong impact on the public. And we are saying that this is the second period, this period when the science itself is questioned, is really difficult to explain or study with the use of existing toolbox that we have within political science, international relations, or just those people who study this climate skepticism. Because this mistrust in science and the consequences of that, and the reasons for the mistrust in science, and how this mistrust of science is translated into skepticism, is really difficult to grasp with the traditional methods of traditional approaches of political science. And therefore we need something new, some new toolbox, and we believe that humanities is where we can find this toolbox. And the main reason why we think this is the case, that humanities can help us with this, is that what kind of unites the skeptics and unites them among themselves, but also with other skeptics, other actors that we can call skeptics of science, is, for example, flat earthers and different pseudo scientists, is that their arguments are very, very appealing and easy to understand. So they are basically producing some kind of narrative. They're producing clear, tidy story that it's very easy to understand and explains everything in just a couple of sentences, basically, in a couple of concepts. So it seems that it's true because it's so easy and so easy to understand and so clear. And what we believe is that at the core of this is good storytelling. So basically, these arguments that are used by climate skeptics are basically very good stories, and there we have the whole discipline that deals with narration, with storytelling, and that's humanities in different forms. Of course, we have literature that deals with some kind of issues, and then we have anthropology that discusses things from different perspective. We have even folkloristic, right, that focuses also on stories. So there's so many different subdisciplines without humanities that deal with these issues. So what we want to do, we want to look into the tools and methods that are already there, but just in different disciplines. These different disciplines is humanities, and we want to apply it to analyze these stories and these arguments used by critics of climate change. We are not there yet, but where we are is that we tried before besides environmental humanities, there are already also energy humanities, and they are focusing on energy transition. And we actually did a whole volume on this, where we kind of find out that this is not so easy as we thought, and this is much more complex. So that's why we are kind of going deeper, a little bit different direction, but we still believe deeper with climate humanities. And we are very much interested in environmental humanities because climate discussion is part of this as well. So maybe we won't be using that concept of climate humanities at all after at the end, but we'll see. And there was also some other efforts to explain how humanities can help us with energy transition, for example, or in general in climate policy and energy policy. There is petrocultures that deal with the impact of oil on societies and on culture and on all of this. So they use humanities and other tools from humanities to describe some things and to analyze things, but a kind of a complex toolbox hasn't been produced yet, and this goes also with other projects that they were mentioning there. So I would like to stop here and just wrap up saying that what we believe is that humanities can help us to find out why climate skepticism is so popular or so dominant, and why it is gaining such a why it gained such important place in the discussion, because of the its narrative aspects. And this is what we would like to study in the future. Thank you so very much. Sorry about the technical mishaps. I will try to pause. No, I think I should stop sharing. And now I'd like to give floor to Antonia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matos. Can you see this? Well, hi everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'll try to be very, very fast. Sorry about the title, but I really think this is a kind of a all hands on deck situation. And of course, adaptation and mitigation are the key concepts. But to talk about climate change is also to talk about ignorance, cynicism, negationism, denial, as Matos just suggested, and above all, fear. And that is the battleground of the humanities, for they are something like the archive and the laboratory of human emotions. So we need the humanities in order not to panic and cultivate instead empathy, curiosity, and courage, or to fight cynicism, ignorance, and fear with their own ability to inquire, to feel and act with others. Each person and each group will have to take care of their part of the forest or the watershed, find their spider web, activate their superpower to organize themselves into networks, circles, or communities that cultivate solidarity and justice. This requires wisdom and cooperation, and this is where philosophy comes in. The contribution to the humanities cannot be pinned to a single research project. It will be plural and local, and this is what I will be doing here, just showcasing a few things. My main point is that the contribution of philosophy is helping to activate a multitude of inquiries. And activation is relational, as Seth just explained some minutes ago. Activation is not something that a subject does to an object, but a spark that happens between the two. We activate each other. And the most that philosophy can do then is to facilitate that co-active action. That is why Socrates saw philosophy as maiotics, the art of the midwife, which is not knowledge, but helping to give birth to knowledge. I've said inquiries and not knowledge, and my reason is that most knowledge about climate change is not something that is there already, ready to use, stored as in a bank. It's not finished, it is yet to be. And that's why the Indian anthropologist Arjuna Appadurai speaks of the right to research. More about this later. So I've said that our ability to feel, think, and act with others is key. And in that precise order, why feel first? Because I think we don't feel climate change. If we did, we would act. I'm afraid we will only do it when the planet hurts like a toothache. And this is something we know in philosophy, of course. For Aristotle, virtues are not only dispositions to act in a certain way, but also to feel in a certain way. It's not enough to know the good. It is necessary to desire it. And the problem, of course, is that it has been said that climate change is an hyper object that is spread in time and space that its sheer enormity exceeds our capacity to understand it. In the 1950s, Gunther Anders said that the possibility of an atomic holocaust, it was a supraliminal thought, so we don't fully perceive it. According to Anders, we were facing an unprecedented threat caused by human action, and yet it caused no reaction. Sounds familiar? Well, we continued to perform business as usual without understanding the radical instability of the world. And this inability to feel and think is part of the banality of evil. And this is a first point of contact with Nessa's presentation. As Hannah Arendt wrote, it is as if our brains were unable to follow what we do. So we have a blind spot that doesn't allow us to consider apocalypse. To see it, we need to stretch our moral imagination, something Nessa mentioned as well. Anders proposed a series of daily exercises for that, for instance, to stretch our sense of time out of the continuous present and think in long shots. This is the first of what I call transition skills, and namely the power of imagination to get us out of the bubble and expand our sense of time. This is one of the transformative capacities we need to socialize for a just transition to be even possible. And this anthropologist, Appadurai, mentions two more. Second is the ability to research. Since climate change will destabilize many niches of traditional knowledge, it will destabilize many populations. And spreading around the results of our research into society is one of the classic functions of the university, of course, but this is something else. It is to disseminate the very capacity to generate new knowledge, to democratize the research capacity beyond campus, to universalize the university into, for instance, refugee camps. The third is the capacity to aspire to the optimal scenario, optopia in Kim Stanley Robinson's terms. We need to democratize research literacy because it is transformative. It helps to achieve goals with social value. The optopian capacity also requires cultivating individual and collective ambition, hope, or confidence in our capacity to act. This is important because Anders's position brings us close to despair, to despairing of our agency, to a feeling of being stuck or paralyzed. What we need is the opposite, of course, confidence to transform the world through conscious action. Well, I have to skip this section to save some time. It's a wonderful piece of research, but please check the references in my last slide. It is there and it is open access. It is a wonderful research being made here in the Basque Country. Go back to apocalyptic blindness, as Anders said. So it's necessary to feel the world differently with broader timeframes, and to do it repeatedly, integrating this sensitivity into daily practice. This cannot be learned one for all. It is a set of skills whose exercise requires a certain amount of repetition, training, practice. So I see climate inaction as a freeze reaction, paralysis associated with fear, the terrifying feeling that there is no time, that it's already too late. In contrast, the opposite emotion to fear, hope, is associated with the feeling of having time, ample time. This is something that has been tried in other contexts. For example, here at the University of the Basque Country, we made an intervention within the framework of the equality plan to create time for female researchers. It is well established, and the pandemic only made this worse, that female academics have to overcome more obstacles than men in order to research and publish their results. So using some resources we already had on campus, we focused on organizing 2 week-long micro-retreats for 15 academic women. And the idea is very simple: to create a community of practice that helps them to make time to research and write. I bring this very simple experience here, not only because it shows that with a little ambition to innovate, much can be achieved, but also because it is something that can be replicated everywhere, in many other places and organizations, universities or not, to create the conditions to be able to withdraw for a while and do the work that would otherwise always remain to be done. A multitude of research that can change the world, but that will not be done if we do not change our routines to make time to think the unthinkable. So changing the world requires changing concepts, not just structures and routines. In philosophy, there has been a lot about conceptual engineering, the work of designing, implementing, and evaluating concepts. This should help to eliminate those blind spots, pointing out phenomena that go unnoticed or extracting them from the mess of discussions that take place in every moment. For instance, should we talk about growth or degrowth in terms of GDP, or do we need a morally richer concept such as development? What are the factors that should enter into this conceptual package that we call development? How do we measure it? How do we decouple growth and well-being, etc.? Those are basic concepts, and they are the building materials that economics needs to do its work. Of course, they are not ethically neutral, but their being normative doesn't prevent them from being translated all the time into quantitative indicators and policy. So we have to intervene here. This is a complex work and requires a lot of social and moral mapping tools, such as the ones in the article I haven't discussed on relational values. But they are already being used in a number of research projects. Here in the picture, we see the Aransas Social Innovation Lab, and here 3 different universities we are collaborating around 4 concepts: work, community, democracy, and well-being, trying to re-engineer those concepts. Of course, the most difficult part of the job comes afterwards, implementation, because it's no use having a very precise and functional concept if it doesn't become the majority use. And this takes us to the next and final point. Very close to Aransas is Arrasate, a place that often appears in the novels of Kim Stanley Robinson, second time in the lecture, because its connection with the Mondragon cooperative economic system. Robinson has been said is a science fiction writer. He is one of us. He is a PhD in English, but he is also an environmental hero, has been named such by Time magazine, and took part in the recent COP26. So how does he see the present in 15 years' time? Well, he said that the great toolbox for the fight against climate change is still the STEM disciplines. But there is something very crucial that only us can do. To intervene in governance, law, diplomacy, philosophy, imagination, and above all, financial economics, namely the main driving forces in a world organized around the nation state and neoliberal capitalism. That Robinson is a novelist brings us to the key role of the arts, of course. So to implement any of those engineered concepts, we need to virally circulate persuasive stories that reach many people. That is the role of the arts and culture industries, to universalize a multitude of action research projects that philosophy could help activate if we do our job properly. So finally, for a transformation to spread across the planet, we know it needs to scale up, and that can only be done through changes in norms that become part of the culture and are transmitted between generations. This normative realm includes both ethics and legislation, but also and crucially aesthetics and even parts of religious experience and its scaffolding. Robinson explains it in terms of hardware and software. So changes in planetary hardware will be brought about by rapid changes in the code, in that multiplicity of languages through which we interact with the world. And language is, of course, the prime subject of the humanities. It is our work to do it and to do it well. Today, more than ever, we need engineers working there, writing the software of the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. We have 3 questions for now. I hope I haven't missed any in the chat. I'm going to put them back into the chat. I mean, at the end of the chat, all of them. Sorry, but yeah, it's not at the very end because there are some more comments. But Ryu had a question for Nessa. How solidarity can be an element capable of solving environmental problems between so-called northern countries in relationship to those in the south, in order to mitigate if in relationship to COVID-19 solidarity was invoked, but in reality it was not practiced by our politicians?
That's a great question, and one that I think many of us have been asking since we encountered COVID-19 in 2020. I would say probably it's been managed very badly, as we've seen from our friends and colleagues that live in less well-funded and resourced countries, particularly those of poor nations, island nations, and the global south. A perfect example of that, of course, was with COP26 and the question of inclusivity of people that could or couldn't afford to travel. And one of the big issues there was vaccine equity or inequity. Many of those populations and their leaders of those nation states were unable to travel because they hadn't been vaccinated. And why they hadn't been vaccinated was because of global inequality in the whole vaccine rollout. So it's a big black mark, I think, on the international community. Albeit Mike Ryan, who is, our most famous Irishman, I think now, after Mary Robinson was the most famous Irish person for a while on the global stage, now it's Mike Ryan, who's the director of emergencies with the WHO. He's been a very strong advocate for vaccine equity across, and he said, very often it's said, the pandemic won't be over until it's over for everybody. I think there's lots of lessons to be learned, but unfortunately an awful lot of people have lost their lives along the way.
Also, second question is for you, whether there has been an increase in interest in climate change since the Dune was released, the movie Dune.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's been a reappraisal of other disaster movies like The Day After Tomorrow and all of these, wonderful movies that we've seen in recent years. But I think Dune, and particularly the response to Don't Look Up, has been really interesting. It's on Netflix if anybody has that and wants to watch it. It's a disaster movie, but it's really a parody and a commentary on the climate crisis. And it seems to be very interesting that the critics have come out against it, saying that it's very kind of, it's very heavy, it's overladen with, not very subtle metaphors, etc. Albeit it's star-studded cast. But interestingly, it's gotten rave reviews and it's been fully embraced by ordinary moviegoers. So it's really interesting. Again, interesting that the people sometimes can be ahead of the curve, and we saw that with COVID, how people were ahead of things that were happening as well. So I think actually I would take great hope from that, that I think that people are generally ahead of the curve on these things, and we just need to keep up with it and keep pushing it in that direction. But I think all of these things can only add incrementally to more and more people talking about these things, and for hopefully the policies to move in the right direction.
Thank you very much. The last question for now is for me, from Steph, sorry. Doesn't using the term climate change skepticism instead of denial or negotiation risk enabling and legitimizing big oil's bad faith decades-long disinformation campaign? Thank you very much for this question. I use the term skepticism for practical reasons for now. I totally understand this point, and I think it's a very good point, and I have to change the term because I just wanted to make nice things nice and clean, but I think to be precise, it's much more important because this would be the last thing that I would want to do with the concept. So I will think about how to be more precise from this perspective, because yeah, definitely don't want to help or support big oil and with the arguments, because I think that's exactly what I don't wanna do. Do we have some more questions, or if I would like to ask the questions, the people who ask the questions, whether they are happy with the answers or they would like to talk about them anymore. I know that we are a little bit late, but if there would be one or two more questions, I'm sure that we can discuss. I think there is a kind of one question now by Ashley. The general question: does anyone have any thoughts on how the ability of humanities work and cultural production to address climate change can be enabled, limited by the political social context in which they operate? Oh boy, this is a very complex question. Would like somebody to go? I don't think so. I should be the last to talk. Seth or Antonio, would you like to talk about the social context, political context?
Well, I was trying to. Well, thank you for the question. I was trying to answer in another question in the chat, but that can be done afterwards. No, I think we need a combination. It's very obvious of both top-down and bottom-up activities, and I think we need a lot of pressure from the bottom-up to get more traction and action. And in a way, I think my focus on the right to research had something to do with it. I think we need to empower communities so that they can get the data, get the facts, and deliver the message everywhere. We cannot expect governments only, universities only to do this. We have to spread a lot of information, and more than information, skills in the whole population for this incoming crisis to be tackled. That's the short one.
Would you like to add something, Seth or Nessa?
Well, I mean, I have something in response, but it's not maybe necessarily exactly along those lines. I mean, the question made me think of just in relation to rights of nature, that the politicization of nature's rights in Ecuador has been criticized as something that's definitely limited its the ability of these rights to actually affect significant change in the extractivist model that has the extractivist economic model there. And but interestingly, even there, the politicization and the real animus of the government to rights of nature ultimately led to I mean, some scholars argue that most recently that early politicization has, although it worked in the government's benefit and worked in the benefit of the extractivist economy, has more recently worked by spreading rights of nature norms through the judiciary and by forcing the judiciary to become really cognizant of those new rights. Ultimately, most recently has led to decisions that have actually canceled government-issued permits for mining, for instance, in something that was unthinkable in the first few years since 2008 when those rights were first put in the Constitution. So there, I mean, you have a very interesting political dynamic where the animus against rights of nature, the political context ultimately was, in a sense, self-defeating. At least that's where it is right now. It's very evolving, but that probably doesn't really address the question.
I'm afraid it's time for us to wrap things up. We are a little bit late, so I would like to first of all thank everybody involved today, all the speakers, and of course also our audience and all those of you who ask questions. Very, very good questions. Maybe we can continue with discussion during a networking event that is going to be right after the end of this session, and we will have, there is a link in the chat for the networking event, so everybody's welcome. And I would also like to thank Alexandra and Ben who helped us today. Ben was responsible for the technical support, and Alexandra is from the ENLIGHT team, and she put us all together, and thank you so very much for that. I think this was a very, very nice evening session, and I learned a ton. I'm sure everybody else did too. I'm looking forward to the future cooperation, because this was mostly about food for thought. I think everybody's working on things that can be worked together with everybody else almost. I know that I'm going to send a couple of emails after this, and so thank you very much again, and hopefully see you soon, and maybe even in person, once this whole thing is over. Yeah, exactly. So thank you very much. I hope I haven't forgotten about anything. See you online, see you in person, see you on emails, and see you at the networking event. Unfortunately, I have to excuse myself. I have some family things that I have to take care of. So it's probably this is big already. So have a nice evening, and see you soon. And thank you so much.